So I introduce you to writer, professor, and publisher of Rampike magazine, Carl Jurgens, who will be moderating the first event of the festival, Signal Lost, Stories of Identity, Crime, and Dystopia, featuring Saad Farooqi, Michael Melgaard, and in Windsor's own Jade Wallace. Carl, are you ready to take it away?
I'm ready to go.
All right, off to you, Carl.
Thank you. Welcome to all, and my name is Carl Jurgens. I'm a board member of Literary Arts Windsor, which helps organize the Book Fest, and I'm the former head of the English department at the University of Windsor. And I publish the internationally distributed magazine Rampike, which features authors such as Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, Paul Auster, and artists such as Ian Baxter and plus Louise Nevelson. My publications appear worldwide. Most recently in Japan, my writing appears in the anthology Best Canadian Poetry 2023. It's an honor to welcome you here to the Book Fest or the Festival de Livre Windsor. And this year, Bridging Communities is the theme in honor of the Gordie Howe Bridge. Thanks to Wes for doing the important land acknowledgement. And I will start with Jade Wallace, and her novel is called Anomia. So Jade, you're there?
I'm here, Carl.
Thank you. Okay, so we can hear you, and that's good. So I'll say a brief introduction. Jade Wallace, they, them, is a writer, editor, and critic, as well as co-founder of the collaborative writing entity MADE, M-A-D-E, with Marc Laliberté. Wallace's books include 2 poetry collections, Love is a Place But You Cannot Live There, Guernica Editions 2023, and The Work is Done When We Are Dead, Guernica 2026, and the collaboration collection ZZOO is due from Palimpsest Press in 2025, and their novel Anomia was published by Palimpsest Press in 2024. Welcome, Jade. For this interview, I wanted to wear leather aviators while clutching a pineapple by a roadside as suggested in your novel Anomia. So sorry I'm not doing that because I can't be at a roadside. Well, I guess I could if I copied the counselor from earlier, but I'm not doing that earlier. I'm not doing that right now. So the title of your novel is Anomia, a form of aphasia where one has difficulty finding words. Aphasia affects communication. Did you choose the book's title partly because of the integral narrative disjunction in the book?
Yes, but also before I answer your question, I have a funny story. So when I was working on the novel and it was untitled, I was walking around as I often, like in the neighborhood where I live, as I often do when I'm stuck on something with writing. And this word came into my head, anomia, and I could not at all remember what it meant. I just knew the word. And I was like, that's going to be the title of the novel. I don't know why, since I don't know what it means right now, but it's going to be the title. And I went home and I looked it up, and of course it means exactly as you said it means. And I realized it did, in fact, fit the novel. So it was a nice irony because, you know, the word is about forgetting words, and there I was remembering the word but forgetting the meaning, and etc. So there was a sort of disjuncture in the whole process of coming up with the title as well. But as for why I thought it actually fit as a title thematically was because one of the sort of central conceits or experiments of the novel, if you will, is the fact that there is never a reference to sex or gender. So we have this whole range of characters whose bodies remain a little bit obscure and whose presentations remain unlabeled. And so I thought anomia was kind of a nice word for a world where all of these terms and connotations we associate with sex and gender have just been sort of forgotten by the inhabitants of the world. It seemed to sort of encapsulate that process where they don't even really recognize that they've forgotten. It's just not part of their vocabulary anymore. So I thought it was interesting in that way. But also the novel is in general very preoccupied with naming and the struggle to name and what names do for us in terms of how we understand the world and how we understand each other. And so I thought that calling the book Anomia really foregrounded the importance of naming, identity, language, all of which are recurrent themes in the book in various ways, not just with respect to sex and gender.
Okay, thank you. Names and speaking of names, names and unnames and stylistics suggest a liminal zone between what is no longer and what has not yet happened. Could you please comment a little bit about the liminality in Anomia and, if you like, the chapter Polyonymous, among others?
Yeah, so I think liminality functions in several ways in the novel. It's interesting that this is a panel. That is the book. It was actually designed by my partner, Mark LaLiberty. He does beautiful design work. But liminality, I think the first way it features is the entire imagining of the novel. It's interesting that we're in a panel on dystopias because I kind of think of Anomia as a bit of a utopia sometimes. A world where, you know, sex and gender oppression just kind of doesn't exist because no one recognizes sex and gender as things anymore. And so it's a liminal space in that way. Like in all other respects, it more or less is recognizable. I think it looks like our everyday world in many ways, except in that extremely notable absence. And so in that way, it feels a bit like a liminal space. And then the other deliberate choice I made, which I didn't make at first, I kind of had already written a draft of the novel, but it's loosely based, I will say, on Southern Ontario. Like if you've been in small towns in Southern Ontario, you probably recognize the principal setting of Euphoria. But the actual town of Euphoria is a complete invention. So it's a space that exists only sort of in a fictional sense. I mean, it resembles our everyday world, but it's also completely removed from it because it doesn't exist. So the setting of the novel is liminal. And then I also was really interested in not having the novel completely married to a particular time in history either. I mean, it is to an extent. It's like it clearly takes place somewhere between 2000 and now. People have cell phones, they use the internet and that kind of thing. But I didn't really want to get any more specific than that kind of broad range of time. There's also some very, you know, a little bit throwback type things in it. Like there's a video rental store where one of the characters works. And so there is a bit of a mixing of signifiers in terms of when socially you would be thinking that this is happening. And so it's difficult to pinpoint, you know, not to compare myself to Wes Anderson, but there's like a little bit of that Wes Anderson thing happening where it's not quite easy to pinpoint the exact time it's taking place. And so that was really important for me because I didn't want the story to be wholly fixed to a place or a time. And so in both those ways, it's a little bit slippery. And so I think it's kind of inevitable that the whole novel has a bit of a liminal feel, which I think makes sense. I mean, all novels are imaginary worlds to an extent, but this one, it really, like, it tries to elide reality. And so I thought tying it too closely to a time, a place, and things like that just didn't fit. It didn't fit the effect that I wanted to go for here. I want you to have a sense that you're stepping slightly outside reality.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much for that answer. Michael Melgaard, who is a part of this BookFest session. Hi, Michael. He writes comments favorably on Anomia, saying the town is out of time. And Amanda Earle reviews Anomia in the Thames Review, noting that you have a skewing of time. The town of Utopia seems to have its own temporal realities or temporalities. Could you please comment on your sense of time in Anomia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things you'll very quickly notice about the novel is that it skips between past tense and present tense because there is like a whole part of the novel that is taking place in the past as far as the characters are concerned, and then a whole other sort of arc that is taking place in their present. And so it's very achronological. The chapters are all kind of, I would say, mixed together. I mean, I have a more specific structure, but it's not really exciting to try to describe it. You just kind of hopefully will appreciate it if you read it and experience it. But the important factors are that it's achronological, and that to me really spoke to the fact that I see time, not to be, not to step too much outside of talking about the novel. I see time in the novel, but also just in life as being very like a layered thing, like time as being almost like, you know, when you're walking and there's like all these layers of sedimentary rock under your feet from all the geologic eras. And so there's like a real sense of many things existing at the same time that are from different periods of time. Like I kind of think of the human experience of time as always being like that in a way, like always layered. Like you cannot see anything without seeing it kind of through the veil or the lens of your past experiences. And you can't really, or I can't anyways, I can't really seem to experience the present without sort of projecting into the future and considering how like what I'm doing now is going to translate into a future time. And so I feel like at any moment we are sort of existing in the past, the present, the future simultaneously. Like the present is where we are, but the past and future are always superimposed on it. And so I think that that sort of personal sense of time I have really got brought into Anomia. And then practically the way that plays out on the page is there is a lot of flipping between past and present in the way I'm telling the story, but also like characters, nostalgic is the wrong word, but they tend to be constantly reflecting. They can't really escape their past experiences. It's always being brought into their present, and they're talking about it in dialogue, or they're remembering particular experiences they had. And so the things are overlapped in that way as well.
So I'm going to go off the beaten track a little bit because you've raised a really interesting point about time, and I'll ask you to extend that conversation a little bit by talking about an eternal moment that you try to represent in language in some ways. Could you say a little bit about that, and maybe your choice of language and words or syntax as it's applied in this novel?
That's interesting because my experience of it is not eternal. My experience of it is that everything is ephemeral, but also cumulative at the same time. It's like everything is in constant flux, and so in that sense, ephemeral. But also there is like a persistence, like nothing ever really disappears from the past completely. It's always inflecting the present in some way. So I guess that is how I would answer that part of the question. And then in terms of language, I mean, probably the main way it manifests, apart from my fixation with tense, is that for me, like language is always very ambiguous, and like trying to navigate the ambiguities of language and use them and make them productive. Like I like to lean into the ambiguities of language a bit to sort of, I don't know, call upon the reader to like fill in the gaps a little bit themselves, like draw attention to the gaps and recognize the way that like it is partly a reader who's always like, you know, fleshing out your story in a way. Like the writer can only do so much on the page. And I try to be sort of conscious of that as I'm writing and make sure that the ambiguities are doing something and they're not just there accidentally.
Yeah, and some of your names like Fur and Split and Fane are very short. So is there a reason for that?
Someone commented on that almost all of the names except for Culver are all these one-syllable names.
Blue, for example.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe it's being a Jade. I'm just used to the one-syllable nomenclature, so that's maybe perhaps what I gravitate to. But the naming process, I wasn't thinking about that part consciously. What I was really consciously concerned with, of course, was if you're trying to construct characters who don't have an identifiable sex or gender, naming is obviously a really key part of that. So what I ended up settling on as a method was picking names that aren't really human names normally, like Fane, F-A-I-N is certainly a word in English, but you know, we don't really name our kids that. And so I like the idea of having words that were sort of recognizable, but not normally used as names. And so they sound like names, but they kind of escape the problem of being gendered or us having gendered associations with them per se. And yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. That helps a lot. Yeah, and it helps explain why people are named names like Slip, for example.
Yes.
Because perhaps he's a slippery character. I don't know.
Yes, I did try to have the names be resonant for the characters in some way, like pick up on some other feature of their identity.
Yeah. So in the meantime, Karina Chung, who was longlisted for the 2024 Giller Prize, says Anomia divides between genres, realities, and genders. Could you say something about the dissolutions in Anomia and why they're there? You already commented briefly on this, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I talked about genders, but I actually don't think I talked about genre too much. So one of the things that was not a difficulty, but an interesting challenge in writing the novel was when I started the novel, I had this idea that I wanted to write a novel without sex or gender. But I was like, in order to make it a novel, obviously there has to be a narrative component to it. And I really wasn't sure at first what that would be. And I started thinking about it. And one of my sort of preoccupations is like missing persons narratives. I have very ambivalent feelings about true crime as a genre, but I'm really fascinated by this sort of subgenre of missing persons narratives. And it made sense to me to have that as a novel, like for the novel to, in multiple ways, be structured around absences and trying to understand those absences and work through them. And so there is an element of the novel that's kind of like it's a bit of a mystery story. There are these two people who go missing and their friends are looking for them and other characters get embroiled in the drama. And I saw that for me as like complementary to this sort of other story or other reality that was unfolding around the absence of sex and gender. They kind of paralleled each other in that way. And then at the same time, though, I'm a little bit of a fickle fiction writer. I actually have my background in poetry, and I get very easily bored with fiction, or at least I get very easily bored with writing fiction. And so I have a tendency to really want to play a little bit with genre. And so, obviously there's a mystery element, but I'm not trying to write a mystery novel. There are also these, like what I called poetic interludes. And I remember my publicist from the press was like, what are you talking about, poetic interludes? And I was like, they're not really crucial to the narrative. They're just these like poetic asides. They just have this lovely language and these ideas I want to explore a bit in the novel. And they're not poetry. They're just vaguely poetic. They're like thematic more than narrative. Anyway, so that was like one of the ways I sort of was flipping a bit between really classic prose and a more poetic approach to prose poetry, if you will. And that was partly my own boredom, but also partly I really wanted to lean into kind of the lyricism of language and how attentive you can be to language. I wanted to draw attention to the language because to me that also was complementary to this whole experiment I wanted to do around obscuring sex and gender. Like, I didn't want the novel to feel less rich because of that. I didn't want it to feel like you were just missing something. I wanted it to feel like something was missing, but it was still a very lush world that you were entering.
Right. And so we have two other authors, Michael Melgaard and Saad Farooqi. And so perhaps you could read a little bit from your novel.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay. I'm just going to read a few pages from the first chapter. I think that really eases everybody into the novel. And this first chapter is about one of the main characters, Slip, who, well, I guess you'll meet. This chapter is called They. There are times when all gestures feel like reenactments, when life and death are clouds that cannot be pulled apart, and it is then that Slip goes to the unwood. The underbrush murmurs, giving away the rats as they crawl into hiding on their small paws. Birds vanish with a clapping of wings. Stones are rough-skinned and heavy in the hand. Holding them, it is impossible to think that reality is an optical illusion, an oral delusion, or a trick of memory. Branches snap underfoot and human nerves crackle with the electricity of living things. The Unwood is on the edge of euphoria, the town where Slip was born and still resides alongside some 40,000 others, a population that has changed little throughout the past several decades. If one takes the main street north out of the downtown, past the suburbs, through orchards and meadowland just beyond the trailer park to the forest, then, if willing, one can continue on foot through the thick and pathless plant growth. The venture seems senseless for a long while, which is probably why Slip has never met another human being there. That, of course, and the local lore, which has rendered the place perilous and macabre. With patience and skepticism, however, one can reach the Unwood, which is the name that the locals have given to the large clearing in the trees where everything that is other than a tree grows ardent and reckless. It is not a trip to be made too often, especially for Slip, who is a little ghost of a person, diminutive in size as well as persona. Pigment has slithered from Slip's hair, soft tissue has fled from Slip's frame. A lifetime has sucked the calcium from Slip's skeleton. Even Slip's owl-round glasses are translucent as though they too are disappearing. Yet those same long years of living have made the weekly trek into the Unwood necessary. Without children, without a living spouse, siblings, or parents, and with most acquaintances long since dead or their names forgotten, nearly everyone Slip meets these days is a stranger, and all strangers offer is irritation. Only the deer of the Unwood, wary at a distance and terrified up close, have retained their regard for Slip, who returns the favor. Today, bending depressed fingers to an aching right ankle, Slip glimpses spots of lightness among the grasses whose blades are wide as rope. The lightnesses, wax white as Slip's hair, appear at first to be mushrooms, livid and smooth, gathered close in a fairy ring. Slip moves closer, crouches down gingerly, and brushes off the green. The mushrooms are bones. Whose bones? There is no taxonomist, no taxidermist available to consult in the Unwood where humankind can be neither seen nor heard. For all we know, the bones might have been scattered during a carnival of predators, a raucous and callow ritual with vines hung for ratty streamers overhead, half-chewed meat strewn on the floor. After the party, only the detritivores would have remained to lick the plates. Slip laboriously clears the flora from the bones, which form no discernible shape. The temptation to rationalize the bones into a skeleton is overwhelming. Once they are ordered, the bones might mean differently. If Slip does nothing, the bones will soon be completely interred by verdure, which would not be so bad for the bones, but it would be a disappointing outcome for Slip. There is some worth in figuring out what kind of animal the bones used to be, isn't there? Stirring the bones from their rest profanes a sacred stillness. Nevertheless, Slip continues with the work, ruffling the feathers of ferns to see whether they conceal the last organs of a corpse, brushing soil away from its own protrusions, gathering the findings in an elegant mass. There are more bones than Slip expected, but also fewer, for though the bones are many, there is no skull. Without the skull, it is hard for a layperson to make sense of the long, the short, the irregular, and the sesamoid bones, and even the other flat bones. Slip could as easily be looking at a horse as at a human being. Perhaps if the ribs still formed a single cage, Slip could articulate the skeleton and get some sense of scale. Scattered as they are, the bones signify nothing but death.
Thank you. That's perfect. Really appreciate that, and thank you to Jade Wallace for the wonderful reading. I don't know
Thank you, Carl.
how we can react, or you can raise your hand or do something or clap. I think online, where everybody can applaud like this. So thanks very much. And our next author is Michael Melgaard, whose novel Not That Kind of Place is Michael. Did I say it right? Should there be some inflection on the word that?
I don't know. Not that kind of place. Do I inflect that? I don't think I do.
Well, one of your critics said that. They said it's not that kind of place.
Oh.
Yeah, anyway, so I was just curious about that. So I'll introduce you and then I'll ask you a bunch of questions. Michael Melgaard is the author of the short story collection Paul Bearing. His writing has appeared in the Best Canadian Short Stories Anthology as well as Joyland, Lit Hub, plus elsewhere. He's the former book columnist for the National Post, originally from Vancouver Island. He currently lives in Toronto. Welcome, Michael. And so I'll start with a question. Stephen Beattie in the Toronto Star makes a connection between Not That Kind of Place and David Lynch's Twin Peaks. It's mostly because of the name Laura, I think. Would you agree with Beattie's assessment that you're trying to reveal small town life as it is in this a biting kind of satire by exposing social rot and corruption?
Well, to start with the Twin Peaks thing, that was kind of an accident. I didn't do that intentionally. I'd written a book that was based. It's called Griffith in the book, but it's based loosely on my hometown, which is on the west coast of Canada. And my hometown is a former logging town. There's lots of, it's deep in the woods. There's mountains. There's logging roads. There's bikers and drugs and everything like that from Twin Peaks. And in my hometown, there's a mountain. It's called Mount Prevost, and it has two bumps on it. And I'm bad at making things up, so I just put all that in the book. And then I sort of realized the two bumps is kind of like Twin Peaks. But I kind of thought all logging towns are kind of like Twin Peaks, and it's more that David Lynch did a pretty good job of that end of it, like representing kind of a falling apart old logging town. The decision to call the character Laura was just because, again, bad at making up things. I was looking for a name from the 80s, and in elementary school there were 3 Lauras in my class all growing up. There was Laura A, Laura C, and Laura M. So I was like, that's a common name from back then. I'm going to call this character Laura. And I wish I hadn't done that, because calling her Laura has invited all these it ties it a lot more directly to Twin Peaks, because there's very famously a girl who goes missing in Twin Peaks named Laura Palmer. If I'd had a chance to do it again, actually, I almost called her Jennifer, because there were 2 Jennifers in my class, but that's my sister's name, and she wouldn't have appreciated getting killed in my book. So I was kind of aware that it might draw comparisons to Twin Peaks, but I also was kind of like, oh, this show's been off the air for 30 years. I think I'm safe. But then Stephen Beattie at the Star, he's like, Gen X guy, so that was right in his wheelhouse, and he just put that together. But to answer the main question about the satire, I don't know if it was really satire, but I was just trying to show the town, again, based on my hometown, how it is. I was curating reality a lot to focus on the bad, because most of what I write is like a total bummer. So I was really like pulling out all the bad things in the town. But yeah, it was meant to sort of examine the fundamental rot that comes with all these towns that were founded around an industry, like my hometown, Griffith, in the book, was founded on the logging industry. It's kind of a colonial project. You drop a bunch of people in, you extract all the resources, and then once those resources are gone or the industry dies, you've got kind of people there with nothing to do, and a rot sets in. It was founded on rot. And so that's what I was kind of trying to get at there.
Right on. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. Yeah. Okay. Not that the connection with Twin Peaks is such a bad thing, because it was a very popular television program, and so it probably doesn't hurt your novel at all. The next question is, Michael Bryson in the Miramichi Reader says the hunt isn't so much the search for the murderer as the revelation of a collective malaise, which you've already talked about. So my question is this a coming of age story, or maybe, if you want to use a fancy word, a Bildungsroman about the murdered woman's brother, David, who has lived a sheltered life, but moved to an awareness of systemic violence, misogyny, and racism in his community?
Yeah, I think it sort of is. I mean, David in the book, he's just like a guy. I don't know if you've ever met just like a regular regular sort of guy. You know, he grew up in his parents' house, stayed in the basement, didn't really get out a ton, got a job in his hometown, always worked at the same thing. Thinks he maybe had a bit of a hard life because of being part of this murder when he was a child, but he has no real grounds for comparison that he can kind of get out of his own head and identify his privilege. He would be a notion that he has any privilege at all. He's just like that sort of guy. Honestly, he's not a bad guy, but he gets into this situation completely by accident where he sort of accidentally begins to learn about his sister's murder, and through that kind of begins to learn about the town as he almost unwillingly digs into it a little. I don't know if it was the review you mentioned or a different one. There was a reviewer who said that he cares about solving the case as little as is possible while actively moving the plot incrementally forward, which sounded a little it wasn't meant as an insult, I don't think, but it is exactly the structure of the book to me. He's very reluctant to learn anything about the town, but it is kind of forced on him. Just that inability to learn anything, and I kind of base that on like it's like the sliding doors version of me. If I hadn't got out of my town and learned a thing or two about the world, I feel like, and some friends of mine who stayed behind in town are kind of like this, where they're just not really aware of things. So I thought in the book it was very important to have him. Things are explained to him. There are a lot of women in the book who explain to him what the world is like. His sister's old friend who has become a social worker, his mother through the recordings, and even a woman who's kind of implicated in the murder, all just tell him what the world is like. And he listens, but I don't think of it as a coming of age novel, because usually in one of those books well, first of all, he's quite old. He's like 38. But in those books, usually there's a change where at the end of it, you have learned something. And David has heard a lot and doesn't disagree with it, but I don't know that he's actually going to change anything about his life at the end of it based on what he's learned. And I thought that was kind of important to the character, too.
Beautiful. Can you say a little bit about the incrementality of the writing? Just
The
briefly.
slow pacing. I shouldn't say
which is
slow
really
pacing.
the
My
scope of-
publicist gets furious at me when I say slow pacing. It's more when I was writing it, I was playing with a bunch of different structures for it, and I had been reading. Wes mentioned Frankenstein during the opening remarks, and I had been reading a bunch of. I read Frankenstein. I was reading a bunch of 17th, 18th century literature, and I was so used to books being paced a certain way, it was refreshing to read these books where the pacing is a lot slower and kind of demands a little more attention, I think. My favorite part in Frankenstein, there's this amazing action-packed scene where he's up on the mountain and the monster is chasing him, and in the book the monster's really fast. It's not slow Frankenstein. So Victor's hiding in the shack. He sees the monster running at him across all these ice fields. He knows he's trapped, nowhere to go. Monster gets him, corners him in the cottage, and then tells him a 20,000 word story. This is what I've been doing for the past 10 years. And it's this long, slow catch up. And I was like, in a writing class, they tell you not to do that, but I was like, it works perfectly good, so why not play around with that a little? So, yeah, I made some decisions based around that, just not being so obsessed with keeping the plot moving well, it's kind of mystery adjacent. I didn't want it to be plotted like a mystery book, basically. I wanted it to be a little slower and a little more intentional.
Yeah. Okay, great. Literary rules were made to be broken, I think. You've got an accomplished background as a journalist working for the National Post. Not That Kind of Place is set on a Vancouver Island where you once lived, and this book is available as an audiobook narrated by Nick Mondelli. Perhaps this is a better question for Marilyn Biederman, who takes care of business for you. But could you say a little bit about marketing your writing, including garnering Ontario Arts Council and Canada Council grants?
Sure, yeah, the marketing of the book was a little tricky. I had written this book. I didn't set out to write a mystery. I'd written a short story collection that was all set in, again, my hometown, or based on my hometown. And while I was writing those, I had written a few stories that had crime in them. There was a story about a guy whose sister had gone missing on the mountain. And there was another one about some bikers turning the basement of somebody's house into a grow op. And just kind of these crime stories didn't really work with the collection I put together. So I removed them. And then I was playing around with this idea of working all the crime stories into something longer. And that kind of grew into the novel. But I didn't sit down and think I'm going to write a mystery. It just kind of happened by accident. And it wasn't until I finished the second draft where I was like, oh, I have an unsolved murder. There's like all these things happen. I'm like, oh, it's a mystery book. Oopsie daisies. And then when I submitted it to my publisher, to their credit, they I feel like certain publishers might have pressured me a little to pick up the action and actually make it a mystery, but I never got any of that pressure from Anansi, my publisher or my editor. They were like, it's a literary book. We'll try to sell it as a literary book. But they did warn me, because there's this unsolved murder in it, you're going to be on a lot of murder panels. It's just the way book promotion goes. And I have been, and largely it's been fun to be on the murder panels, to be honest. It's the book is just different enough that I feel like mystery readers who pick it up kind of enjoy it because it's not meeting their expectations of pacing. I mean, I should be careful. I have looked at my Goodreads. There are some people who are not happy with me playing around with pacing, but some people do enjoy that. And yeah, so marketed as a mystery, and I'm happy to be in that space for sure.
That's great. Yeah, and can you say a little bit about getting Ontario Arts Council and Canada Council grants?
Um,
I believe you've got both.
yeah, I don't know. They're great to get. They're a necessary part
Free
of
money.
being a writer in Canada, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately. It's great that they exist. It's great to get them. But the reality of publishing in Canada is there's not a lot of money being thrown around, so you do need grants to kind of help make ends meet. I don't know that I would have finished either book without the grants. Yeah, so beyond that, I mean, I always apply and I'm grateful to have them. And I think everyone else here probably feels the same way. You can nod, and
Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Money is good. So can you say a little bit about the painting behind you? It's just over your right shoulder there.
Guy. Oh, thanks. You guys probably can't even see it. I should. It is a very detailed ink drawing by Johnny Peterson, who is a my best friend and an artist from Victoria. And he ran an art gallery in Toronto called Weird Things on Bathurst for many years. And I rented a office space in the basement from him. It wasn't office space. It was a like it was where the water heater was. It was just this tiny room, and I wrote this book and my first book in his little office. He's since moved back, but he's a wonderful artist who you should check out. Weird Old Junk on Instagram.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks
thank
for
you very
asking
much
about
for that. Yeah, and it's been said by your publisher, Anansi, that your deceptively spare prose carries powerful emotional weight. For example, the novel's closing chapter features David speaking to a policeman with the lines, "Remember that guy Farley? You might be too young. Crazy guy my uncle knew. Said he was in contact with aliens and then one day he was gone. Left a note that said he was going to rendezvous with them." So can you say something about your so-called spare writing style? Is it a result, do you think, from your journalism?
No, I don't think it came out of my journalism. I wasn't like the journalism I did was mostly arts journalism, so there wasn't really that expectation to have the short, punchy writing that you think of when you think of a reporter covering a crime story or something. The development of that style came more out of when I was a younger writer, just kind of figuring things out. I was writing about a number of different things, and then I eventually settled on writing about my hometown and sort of my dad had been a bricklayer. I wrote a lot of stories about bricklayers and like the kind of guys my dad would put up his bricklayer friends as they were getting divorced. So I heard all these stories growing up and I was like, I'm just going to write all those down. Again, I'm very bad at making things up. Just write down what people have told me and I got myself a story. But when I was writing those, I was doing a style that I would say, a young man trying to sound literary and smart. And it didn't really work with the content I was using, and then I realized I had to kind of pare it down and speak in the language of the characters. And also, as far as like delivering the emotion and stuff, these are people. My characters often aren't super in touch with their emotions, so it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time explaining what they're feeling in any given moment or something. I kind of try to let actions speak for themselves within that structure. So it kind of, yeah, it just developed out of trying to write in the voice of the characters, I would say.
Yeah, so I get it. Yeah. So spare style is, you're saying it's not part of your journalism, which has to be pretty tightly worded. So I'm thinking in that direction. So I was thinking that I see a connection in that regard because I'm also interviewing Marty Gervais, who is also a former journalist, tomorrow, and he writes poetry, but his style, I think, is affected by the journalism years of practice, just because it's necessary. No?
Uh, well, like I said, I did arts journalism, so I do not like book
Oh,
reviews
okay,
and whatnot. So I wasn't really covering stories that require that sort of like Hemingway sending it over the cable style of writing.
I get it. Yeah, thank you very much. Um, and so the reason I mentioned the painting in your background was because I'm sure people remember Jade Wallace had a kind of forested image behind her, which fits really well with the Unwood and her novel. So in the meantime, I'm wondering if you could read a little bit from your book.
I'd love to.
Okay,
So
fantastic.
this is right from the almost the beginning. There's a little prequel chapter where this is the night that David's sister has gone missing. She's gone for a run, hasn't come back. They've realized something's wrong, and David and his dad are driving up the mountain, up the logging road behind their house to look for her, because that is where she usually goes to run. So David's dad turned off the engine at the dead end. He said, "Wait here a minute," and got out. He shone his flashlight into the bush on his side of the car, and then walked into the beams of the headlights. He looked up the logging road beyond the gate, shouted, "Laura." David jumped at the sudden noise. They both waited. He walked to David's side of the car and shone the light into the woods, shouted Laura down there. Then he said, "I'm going to take a look up the road." David's dad walked around the gate and to the edge of the pool of light from the headlights. The beam of his flashlight swung from side to side, and every few feet he'd say Laura until that got too quiet to hear, and his light disappeared around the curve of the logging road. David got out of the car and hopped up on the hood. The cooling engine clicked and dinged under him, then stopped. There wasn't any wind, there wasn't any sound at all, just the woods at night. David looked into the darkness beyond the headlights, where his dad's light was no longer visible. The road switchbacked up the mountain, a few hundred feet in, turned around and came back to above where they were parked, then switched again and curved around the mountain, spiraling twice around until the top, where there was an old monument erected at the end of the First World War. When David was in grade 8, his friend Eric's uncle had told them about an abandoned mining town on the next mountain over. He gave the kids directions, and they decided to find it. They didn't tell anyone, just set out first thing in the morning with food, their Swiss Army knives, and Derek's pellet gun. They hiked over the mountain and down an old path that led to a wooden trestle his uncle had said would be there. They crossed the river and followed the old rail track until it disappeared. They kept on through the woods until they got stopped by cliffs, and then went back down to what they thought was the river between the mountains and tried a different route up. It was past lunch before they got to a clear cut on the side of the mountain. They could see for miles into a valley they had never seen before, the skyline blocked by unrecognizable mountains. They found a road coming into the clear cut. It was overgrown and muddy. They followed it for an hour and were relieved when it joined up with a better logging road. But after 2 hours of walking along that one, arguing over whether or not to take turns, which way was east or west, what the moss on the trees meant, they grew panicky. The sun had just set when the road they were on met up with the gravel road that led them, well after dark, to the highway. They walked along it until they had hit a gas station and called David's dad from there. They had ended up practically in the next town over, 20 kilometers away. David's dad waited until he'd dropped Eric off before laying into David, saying how stupid he was to head off like that without telling anyone. When they got home, he pulled out a map of the area and showed David why he was so mad. At any point, if they'd made a wrong turn, they would have ended up in the Crown Land that went on for 100 miles of mountains and creeks and forest, an endless nature that only ended at the ocean on the west coast. Until that moment, the forest had been a playground. Even lost in it, David hadn't thought anything bad could happen. They would spend a night in the woods and walk out the next day. Looking at that map, he felt the immensity of the nothing all around them for the first time. The night his sister went missing, he sat on the edge of those woods, under a small pool of light, and felt that immensity press in again.
Thank you
Saad.
very much. Okay, and let's have a big hand for Michael Melgaard.
Thank you.
Yay. Fantastic. And next we have Saad T. Farooqi. I think I pronounced the name correctly.
You did.
Okay, thank you. And Saad T. Farooqi holds an MFA in creative writing from Kingston University, London, and a BA in English literature from the American University of Sharjah. His short stories and poems have appeared in various international magazines, and his shining moment on stage was accidentally setting his poem on fire by standing too close to a candle. I love that. That's a great story. When not writing, Saad enjoys boxing, experimenting in the kitchen to varying degrees of success, or devouring anything film noir. So you'd love Windsor right now because we've got nothing but film noir on the TV if you're too cheap to have an antenna, or if you're cheap and you don't have regular cable. Born in Saudi Arabia, Saad T. Farooqi moved to Pakistan before his first birthday, and there he survived 3 separate kidnapping attempts before he was 8 years old. His family eventually settled in the United Arab Emirates. His debut novel, featured at Bookfest Windsor this year, is White World, published by Cormorant Books. Welcome, Saad.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I'll begin with questions. Quill Inquires Manahil Bandukwala says Pakistan's historical treatment of religious minorities, including minority sects of Islam, makes the world Farooqi evokes all the more visceral and horrifyingly possible. White World features a dystopian Pakistan in the near future. Could you comment on religious discrimination in White World, please?
Uh, well, the thing is, there's no way to talk about the religious discrimination in White World without really talking about the religious discriminations that are rife in Pakistan today, right? The Pakistani flag is 70%, if you've seen it, it's 70% green and 30% white, and the 70% that's green represents the Muslim majority. And why is that? Why is the flag designed that way? Well, it's designed that way because the formation of Pakistan in 1947 was rooted in this idea that Pakistan is for Muslims, right? So when you have that kind of a religious centric notion in the formation of a country, you kind of, it's not a surprise that Pakistan has a big problem with the treatment of Pakistani Jews, Pakistani Christians, Pakistani Hindus, and even other sects of Islam, as Manahil mentions. And, that's the result of that is the sort of second, at best, there's a second-hand treatment. The second sort of, they're treated like second-class citizens, and that's at best. And at worst, it's unfortunately can get really violent. And that's what I like to. That's what I try to show in White World. Anyone who's not a Sunni Muslim stands to be dehumanized. They stand to be displaced. They stand to be discarded at a moment's notice. So whether you see people being forced into other sectors, or you see their places of worship being desecrated, or you're watching people be called and treated as untouchable. Everything I'm describing in White World is basically something that is unfortunately endemic in Pakistan today. That's part of the society today, and it's been that way. Since I was born, when I talk to my father, he talks about the same thing, sort of like all this stuff has happened, and has happened since the beginning. It's unfortunate, but that's just the reality.
Understood. Yeah. Thank you very much. Kevin Hardcastle in Open Book says Saad T. Farooqi transports readers to late 21st century Pakistan, reaching beyond established narratives to create a unique speculative work that truly explores the most fraught and damaging aspects of the political climate in the country, which is basically what you just said. Is this a speculative fiction, as Hardcastle suggests? And could you please comment on the purpose of the hypothetical situations in White World?
Yeah. For me, White World is really just following the idea that I just mentioned that Pakistan is for Muslims. I'm just following this idea to its logical conclusion, really. I make it a point to follow the threads that I describe in the story back to real world events. So if I may, I'd like to share a few facts with the readers and the people who are here as part of answering this question. So fact number one, every year, by some estimates, 1,000 non-Muslim women and girls are kidnapped and they're forced to convert to Islam, and then they're married off. And oftentimes they're married off to the person who abducted them. That's point number one. Point number two, there's in the Pakistani Penal Code, there is Ordinance 20 or Ordinance XX of 1984, and that made it illegal for Ahmadi Muslims, which is another sect of Islam. It made it illegal for them to refer to themselves as Muslims legally. And some 40 years later, that's still the case today. Point number three, in 1971, during the Indo-Pak War, there's anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 Bengali women were unfortunately raped by Pakistani soldiers as part of what's called infamously is known as Operation Searchlight. And all this, their motivation for doing this, one of the reasons they did it was because the mullahs in Pakistan had said that because those Bengali women are siding with our enemy, therefore they are no longer Muslim. So just like that, once again, the rights of people were just revoked. That's just again one instance of this happening. There's so many other times where, at a whim, the government just decided, oh, you know what, you're not a Muslim, your rights are not going to be respected. Another one, point four, the blasphemy law, which you probably have heard of here and there in Pakistan, is continuously used against, is really weaponized against non-Muslims. It's often as a form of intimidation, or it's as a means of land grab, or it's some kind of vengeance, vigilante vengeance over a perceived slight, either personally or against the religion. And sometimes it's all three, unfortunately. And lastly, Pakistan remains one of the 13 countries where atheism is punishable by death. So I bring up all these points just to say that this isn't speculative fiction. Every social malaise that I described and that the reader is going to confront when reading White World has already come to pass in Pakistan and in our history, in one form or another. And even the setting, it's not the fact that White World takes place in a post-nuclear war Pakistan is not as speculative. When you realize that both Pakistan and India are very jingoistic nuclear powers, and then on top of that, they've already had 4 wars. Barack Obama is on record. Barack Obama is on record saying that during his presidency, the issue that kept him up at night was not Palestine, Israel. It was not global warming. It was not Al Qaeda. What kept him up at night during his presidency was the potential of nuclear war between India and Pakistan. So, it's not speculative fiction. This is a cautionary tale, if anything.
Right. Okay, I get it. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, the nuclear winter included, I think it's suggested there. The Cormorant page for White World refers to how you became a writer, and it refers to Albert Camus' novel A Happy Death, which is an absurdist and existentialist work, and about the will to happiness. How influenced were you by Camus' novel A Happy Death?
So a bit of backstory of my own life as a writer and my journey is if it wasn't for A Happy Death by Camus, I wouldn't be a writer. It's as simple as that. My parents had decided that I was going to be an engineer just like my dad. And I didn't think there was any other option available. It was just like, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be an engineer. And until I was 15, I didn't think of any other future for myself. It was only, I the English teacher I had a crush on in high school. She noticed that I had some talent for storytelling in English class, and she's like, "Okay, you have talent, but you're not really reading a lot." So she basically dragged me to the library, and she's like, "Okay, pick a book, and you're gonna read this, and you're gonna write a report on it." So being me, I picked the thinnest book I could find, and it happened to be A Happy Death by Albert Camus. And that book changed the entire trajectory of my life. So whatever I write in some way or another, like A Happy Death is going to be a part of that. But in terms of White World, I think the novel takes inspiration more from Camus in general and his philosophy of absurdism. Avant is the main narrative, the main point of view. His search for Dua is in a world that's devoid of meaning and justice and even logic. Sometimes is pretty much out of Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, for instance. Generally whatever a lot of the characters are seeking so desperately, they're often lost causes, or as Camus would say, they're defeated in advance. But despite it all, I think most of them discover sort of a selflessness and a sort of stoicism as they experience all the loss and suffering around them. And the fact that many of the characters that we see reject nihilism in the end, and they choose to pursue life and happiness despite all the meaningless suffering around them. I think there's a victory in that, and I think Camus would agree.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you very much for that. Good answer. Regarding magic realism, your book is dedicated to Paul Auster, and your rating has been compared to Salman Rushdie's novels. For example, episode 3 refers to Allah Burning the Sky Way, A Nuclear Winter, Ghosts, and a Reddish Mulberry Sky. Could you please comment on your use of magic realism in White World?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't consciously pursue magical realism as I was writing. And I think the sort of the theme with what Jade was saying and what Michael was saying as well. Like a lot of times your book is kind of perceived a way that you didn't really think it would be, or as you're writing the book, it kind of creates a life of its own in a way. And it's like the death of the author, as we all know. What I will so. Whether it's the snow or the burned sky in White World, I try to give hints that or explanations that are on the one hand grounded, like could it be celestial impact, could it be nuclear winter, but they also give metaphysical explanations. And the reason you see both of those is because there's the point of view. There are 4 main point of views in the book, and some of those characters are secular and some of them are not. So it's really depends on which point of view you're in. So you might see something as magical realism, or you might see something as even science fiction or speculative fiction, as Hardcastle said. I think the real influence of Auster and Rushdie and a lot of others like Marquez, Murakami, Cisneros, all those people, is that no one can really agree. None of the characters in the book would, if you talk to them, they would actually agree on the events that are taking place in the book and even the events that took place leading up to the main narrative. And that's because I made it a point that each narrator is unreliable. And I'm going to avoid some spoilers, but there are secret identities and hallucinations, and there's like dream sequences. There's like a fortune teller in the book. There's there references to other books. Book of Illusions by Paul Auster is one of them, and a lot of other books too. And then there's paintings and song lyrics that kind of possibly drop hints as to the events of the book. And so the result of all this, and that was the result I was going for, is like in the Book of Illusions. The result is not necessarily magical realism, but what you do see and what you do experience, and what I want the reader to experience is this sort of deep sense of cynicism towards the nature of reality itself. And that's what I'm going for.
Beautiful. Thanks very much for that. You've got a picture of a blue Volkswagen behind you. Like, what's that about?
Oh,
just very briefly.
Nothing. It was just I love the Volkswagen, and we have an orange wall, and I was like, you know what, that blue is gonna look really nice against that orange, and I just love the Volkswagen. I think it's one of the best looking cars. Even like when you hot rod that car, it looks amazing. Every version of that car looks amazing.
Cool. Well, could you read a little bit from White World? We've got about 5 minutes, and then
Sure.
I have to bid the audience farewell.
I will say I am dyslexic, and I think Jade and Michael did a really good job. So I'm I'm bound to underwhelm, but I'll give it my best. All right. June 14, 2072. For years, I thought there was no one like me in this world. If there's one thing I wish I could tell my 14-year-old self, it would be that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Even before Allah burned the sky away, there were Pakistanis like me who felt lost inside their skins, who felt and sensed the world around them as if they had been born inside a block of ice. Oddly, I was glad that my brothers had chased me away into the Badlands. In that haunting, harrowed place, I met others like me. Some boys and girls were both at once. Some girls who found out that they were boys when they reached puberty. Some men dressed as women, some women dressed as men. There were men who loved men, women who loved women, some who loved both. There were boys and girls like me who felt trapped in the wrong body. In old Pakistan, the world seems a whisper away from ending. Even today, as I pass through sectors 1 or 2 or 3, I'm overwhelmed by a sense that we can never ward off the end of the world because some part of us yearns for it, quietly and patiently. But in the Badlands, as a 14-year-old, I felt it. It was unmistakable, like the smell of rain, like the slight silver shimmer above the river. Hope. It's despite its tents that look like a pile of dirty laundry, its broken windows smeared with bloody fingerprints, and its endless pilgrimage of black clothes, the Badlands is Pakistan's hope. Is the very edge of the world, a place where Pakistan pushed us away decades ago. We were supposed to die. And though we starve and suffer, we strive and continue to survive. Though they fly the PLM flags and blame us as the reason Allah burned the sky away, we're still here. We always will be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Saad Farooqi for his reading. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.
And I will say goodbye because I think our time is just about up. Our charitable organization, Literary Arts Windsor, particularly wants to recognize Canadian Heritage, the University of Windsor, and the Essex County Library for helping make Bookfest Windsor possible. Thank you to the authors of today's program. We want to thank you all for joining us. Books are available online and in person if you happen to live in Windsor at the Biblioasis Bookshop. Otherwise, please contact the publishers. They would be Palimpsest, Anansi, or Cormorant, and then make an order. Support the literary arts. And they make wonderful holiday gifts as well. So get out there and buy some books. And thanks for everybody for joining us. Thank you.